Hey everybody, welcome. Pairadocs, coming to you live.
Howdy.
Coming to you live on Facebook, even though this microphone is not working.
Is not working.
So, we're here. We're going to be visiting about any questions that you might have, which is what we do at 2 o'clock on Thursdays. And also to let you guys know that on Monday we are dropping our second interview with Jamie Ivey, who is from the podcast Happy Hour fame. And she's our very first, what would it be? Repeat interview. How about that? So this week was our 100th episode, and if you haven't heard the 100th episode, yeah. It is interesting that I had the funny stuff and you had all the serious things.
It's not that. Similar to him I wound him up before we said go to Facebook Live, and now he's just going, while I do all the administrative right now.
That's
it's very similar.
Yes. That is a microcosm of life itself.
Between the two of us.
But Jamie Ivey is going to be on on Monday, and prioritizing your spouse is going to be our content show for Monday. So
we've talked about prioritizing your spouse above your children, but this is prioritizing them above anything else, whether it's work or other friends. I know lately I've seen a lot in my office, wives and husbands come in complaining that they don't feel like the priority to the other. And so outside of our relationship with God, our spouses have to be second.
Numero dos.
They have to be the top
for our Spanish-speaking friends.
Earthly priority. And so we're going to talk about that on Monday.
Yeah. And so I'm going to start off today. By the way, if you got any questions, fire them in. On Facebook, via, is it email? Are we doing email, or are we just doing it over Facebook?
Currently, we could do questions live via Facebook. But no, they can always go to paradocspodcast.com and email in questions through the contact tab.
Or if you think of something, you could jot it down and put it in the mail. And we'll also respond to that next year. So I'm gonna start with a question that came up in the session that I just left, and that is because I thought, this would be a very, very good one because it's pretty darn common, and it's I tell people all the time, and we've mentioned here before that.
What's the question?
John Gottman has he has the research that shows that 70% of all marital conflict is not resolvable. 70%. Everyone says, we never resolve our... Well, 70%, Gottman, his research shows, is not ever going to be resolved because it's personality, it's family, it's deep-seated values. So how do we then, and we talked about contentment and how do we find that contentment, and one of the ways of doing that is
what's the question?
What behaviors from your spouse do you just let go, and which ones do you demand that they change?
I was just talking about this with somebody at lunch.
You should have had me come in.
Well, I'll also answer it.
You would have to split your fee. But how do you do that? I mean, if we're supposed to just be content and let these conflicts go and live within the conflict without demanding that we win, what's a good guideline? And as we've mentioned before, I'm a huge fan of Gary Thomas. And in his devotional book, Devotions for a Sacred Marriage, he said, if it's not sin, you can't demand change. For him, that was one of the determining factors. If there's a behavior from your spouse, what do we let go, and what do we insist that they change? And I thought that was just beautiful, and it's worked in my life now. I've seen it work in a lot of different couples' lives. That you got to be honest, because if you say, well, you're ticking me off, and since I've told you you're ticking me off and you're still doing it, that now means you're sinning because you're intentionally trying. No, you can't. if what they're doing is a sin, okay, I'm insisting that you stop beating me with a bat. Okay, that's something you could step up and demand that change. So if it's sin, we can demand change. If it's not sin, it's just something that's really irritating, we can't demand that they be different. And they can't demand that we be different. Go.
Sorry, I was just interacting with the audience, the laid-back country folk.
Yeah.
I now forgot. What was the question again? What do we need to demand change in our spouse, or what can we let go?
Yep.
So the context of the conversation at lunch that I had, or what hills to die on, and because he was talking about something to do with him and his wife's relationship, and he said that it was a sticking point. And I said there should be really few sticking points in marriage. There should really be few hills that we choose to die on. And the ones I listed, but I feel like it was great kind of conceptualized as just sin, were, I mean, I would demand change of my wife if she was having extramarital affairs. I would demand change if she was putting other people before me. I would demand change if she was thinking about or considering like leaving the faith. So I feel like it all fits under that umbrella, but 98% of things are really not hills to die on. That we can't really demand change in our spouse.
Because we say this when we're talking about parenting all the time. You know, you got to choose your battles. You can't fight every battle, so you got to choose your battles. But I'm telling you, the exact same thing is true in marriage. You can't fight every battle. Every behavior can't just twist us off. You've got to be able to choose your battles. And one of the great methods of making that choice is this battle about sin, or is this battle about me just being irritated? And if it's, now again, and when we say something is an irritant, that's putting it lightly for some type of behaviors. And yet, if it's not, and I love that, if it's not sin, we cannot demand that people be different.
Yeah, and you're going to have differences of opinions in marriage, and you've got to trust your spouse. You know, you married them for a reason, and hopefully it's not because you thought that they're an idiot. And so give them credit for their perspective, even if it differs from yours. That they have a brain, that they're smart, intellectual, have good thoughts, and try to find a middle ground rather than just having them always come to your perspective.
Preach it, brother.
All right,
the plate.
Another question.
Bring it home.
Teen suicide has been in the news quite a bit. I know in our area, there's a high school that has a balcony that I think the second or third person has jumped from that balcony 2-3 weeks ago. Anderson, did you hear about that? And then you also have the 13 Reasons Why on Netflix and such. But teen suicide, self-harm, the question is kind of how do you deal with it with your own child if he or she is struggling, as well as how do you encourage your child to help those of his peers that are struggling?
Okay, a couple of things. 99 times out of 100, a teenager who is suicidal is massively depressed. Their brain is telling them that this problem is this problem. And we always say that suicide is a permanent solution to a temporary problem. And so most of the time when you have the kind of cognitive distortion that would lead someone to say, yes, dying is preferable to having my car taken away or my girlfriend breaking up with me. Most of the time, the vast majority of the time, there is depression involved. And being able to get that treated. And I know several years ago there was this scare about using antidepressants with adolescents. And they, antidepressants, can lead to suicide in an adolescent. And so there was this thing of pulling away and not giving adolescents these medications that actually work. They do what they increase neurotransmitters, the serotonin and stuff, and it helps alleviate the symptoms of depression. And when we did that, when we had this knee-jerk reaction, oh my gosh, these medications can in some ways trigger suicide. It was like the first time in 30 years that teen suicide rates increased. And so we were throwing the baby out with the bathwater. So the first thing I would say is don't kind of go with this urban legend that these antidepressants could cause this, because normally if you got a teenager that is struggling with those kind of thoughts, depression's involved, and these medications have proven for decades that they help alleviate the symptoms of depression. Now, we have learned that you just don't throw Prozac at a 12-year-old and say, hey, come see me in 4 months and let me know how you're doing. If a kid is on this type of medication, they're seeing a counselor regularly. The doctor is seeing them regularly, so they got eyes on them to make sure that that things are working well and that they're in a very healthy way, kind of returning to normal thinking. But address what is most likely the underlying cause, and that is depression.
I would say that, if your kid ever admits or communicates thoughts of self-harm, that you don't need to freak out. A lot of people, and self-harm is cutting, it can be burning, some sort of other self-mutilation, whereas suicide is obviously alarming.
I eat a lot of Bluebell. That's very self-harming as well.
Self-harming too.
Slow motion.
So don't freak out when they talk about self-harm. It is not suicide. Okay. It's very different than suicide. If they do talk about killing themselves, you got to distinguish, is this actual, real life, I have a plan and a means, active suicide? Or is the teen just trying to communicate, I'm overwhelmed and I don't know how to deal with my current situation and I'd rather not be here right now? Because those are very different. Probably 95% of the teens we see here have thought about suicide, but they're not suicidal.
They don't want to die.
Paul, I forget where it is.
It's in the Bible. New Testament.
It's in the New Testament.
What else do I have to do, Josh?
He too, I think it's in one of the epistles.
Mm-hmm. One of the Pauline epistles? One of the Pauline prison epistles?
He communicates, I actually don't want to be here on earth either. Okay. Like, it would be better for me if I left, but the Lord has work for me, so I'm going to remain here. So the thought of, man, life is rough right now. Paul happened to be in prison, but life is rough right now, so I don't want to be here. Again, 95% of our kids have thought of that thought, but that doesn't make them active. If they are active, you can tell if you ask them, do they know how they do it, and do they have the ability to pull that plan off? Again, most kids are going to go, no, I've never thought about it. But the kids that do have a plan and do have the means, those I would call and get them either pastoral, professional help ASAP.
And one thing that's always been helpful, even back, when I was doing youth ministry and talking to younger youth ministers and youth workers, even though anytime they verbalize it, you got to take it seriously. Yes. But not all suicidal verbalizations are equal. And I would always suggest people use the SLAP. Is it an acrostic? An anagram with all the first letters? SLAP. The S is for the sensibility of the threat, the lethality of the threat, the availability to help. And the availability of the threat, and then the P is the proximity to help. So if someone says, yeah, I've thought about it, I'm going to kill myself. Well, how are you going to do it? Well, I'm going to shoot myself. Well, do you have a gun? No, but next summer I'm going to get a job and start saving. And so probably, fall of year after next.
Acronym.
That's what it is.
SLAP. We got
so, okay, they're really struggling, but they're probably not red light. But if a kid says, I know where my dad keeps his gun, and I know the combination of the safe, and I know that he keeps the bullets in the sock drawer, and I'm going to wait till they go on their cruise, and then my uncle has a ranch that he does not live at, and so I'm going to go. Okay, then you lock onto their leg and not let them out, let them outside the room. So even though you take every suicidal threat seriously, you can't ignore any of it. Some are more serious than others. And SLAP is a good way of determining that.
And some will try to manipulate with thoughts of suicide to not get punished or to be able to go to the party. and that isn't actively suicidal.
Yep.
So using SLAP, trying to determine, is this kid active, is he
Yeah.
serious, is important. I had a kid one time say he wanted to jump in front of a train, and I thought that was kind of random, just came to his head, and I said, well, where would you find this train? And he said, there's one that passes behind my house every night at 7 p.m. about a half mile away.
Hello, Mr.
And
Boggs.
so that was obviously escalated in my head. So plan means certainly shows seriousness.
And by the way, back to your thing of manipulation, if a kid really wants to die, they really do want to commit suicide, they're not going to use it. It is very personal. They're most likely, of course there's exceptions to every rule, but they're most likely never going to bring it up in a manipulative manner. Let me go to the party or else kind of a thing. Because if they really want to commit suicide, they don't want anyone stopping them from doing it. And so if just letting them go to the party will stop the suicide, anytime that it's mentioned in that type of a coercion type of a situation, it's, again, you take no suicide threat non-seriously. But most of the vast majority of the time, that's going to be something the kid's using to manipulate.
All right, this question comes in from Sophia. She says, love the podcast, just listen to you guys interview on adolescent sexual health. How do you start off young children with a healthy view of sexuality? I feel like I know where you're already going with this. You always give the cars as the example.
That and the chapter of my book, Fearless Parenting with George Barna.
He could go two ways with that. The cars or his own book.
Yes.
Or
way.
Dobson.
Mm-hmm.
I would say that, and this is one of we have a presentation, well, Jimbo has a presentation on ways for you to for sure that your kid watches porn.
Right.
And one of the points in that is you as husband and wife need to show affection. It is, since marriage is the only healthy route that God created for our sexuality, our kids need to see us as, appropriately so, sexual creatures. So flirting and kissing in front of them, they need to understand and know, maybe not win all the time, but know that we have sex. And so one of the best ways is to appropriately model sexuality in front of your kids.
Because what we've done, it's this whole thing of, if we keep doing the same thing the same way, expecting a different result, we're crazy. And what we've done in the church the past 100 years is play like sex doesn't exist. Our homes are sexless, and we think that it's wrong and it's dirty, and that has created. It's almost like we're serving them up to the porn industry on a platter, and so instead of treating it as this taboo subject that it's like Voldemort. It's the subject that must not be named. Reference? You do not know who
Harry
Voldemort?
Potter.
Okay, thank you.
I've never watched them. But
because
it's sinful.
It's sinful. But we've treated it like it's so taboo, and so and all that does is spark interest in the kid, and then they get to school and let their peers and let pornography and media define sexuality, as opposed to us defining it and letting the Bible define it, and not only defining it in the talk, but defining it in the walk. Can I get an amen?
Hey-o!
Is it how we live our lives?
Not in the talk.
In the walk.
But in the walk.
Woo! Pass the plate.
Makes you want to run an aisle.
It sort of does. So it's normalizing it. It's not freaking out when they're naked or when they discover they have a yeehaw zone, but teaching them what's good and right, and calling a penis and a vagina a vagina. And the story I use in the book is of oldest granddaughter, Ruthie, who is Josh's oldest. And Katie, his wife, walks in, and she was 2, 3? Something like that. And she was sitting on the toilet, and she was singing that girls have vaginas and boys have peanuts.
Yeah, she calls penises peanuts. And one time, our second, he's now almost 3 here in a couple months. But they were in the bath together. He was newly born, so this was 3 years ago or so, and she said, "Touch his nuts." What'd you say, sweetheart?
What was that, Angel? What was that?
Touch his nuts. I'm like, huh. But yeah, she calls them peanuts.
So, but the idea is, if we call them your boo-boo or your ding-a-ling, it's like, it's so horrible we can't even say it, and it's that kind of irrational avoidance that almost just heightens the curiosity in our kids. And so normalizing it, being affectionate, they need to know that mom and dad love each other, are physically affectionate. They need to know that mom and dad have sex and what sex is and how come it's great. God thought of it, said it was good. And so mom and dad have sex, they love it within the context of marriage. So it's not, it's almost like sex doesn't even exist outside the context of marriage. And so we get to teach our kids that. Would it not be great for our kids to know everything about sexuality and sex and what God thought of it? And they get to school and some kid whispers that this is what sex is, and have you seen this porn site? You go, well, no, that's not what it is actually. I mean, they're not learning anything from their peers. They already know what it is, and they know what it is in a healthy context.
So model it, be sexual, obviously, again, appropriately, around them and in front of them, and then have the conversation. And to that, I would say, don't just make it, and I know you probably, this was part of your point, but don't make it a one-time conversation. We have the talk with them, and we take them to this special retreat, and all that tells them is that we can't talk about this unless we go to this special retreat. And so it needs to be a semi-normal part of your conversation in training them. It's been 20 minutes. We have another question, but I don't think we have time for it. Next Thursday, the 14th, 2 p.m. Central, be back on with us. Bring your questions.
We'll start with that question.
Sure. And you can also email us this week questions, and we'll answer them live here. Again, this Monday, Jamie Ivey with the Happy Hour podcast. She has a new book coming out that we'll talk about. And then prioritizing your spouse above every other earthly thing will drop on Monday too.
Except the Longhorns. That would be the only thing that your spouse is not prioritized over.
Correct.
Right?
Take care.
Cool. See ya.